In this How-To-Svelte, we'll be doing an autocomplete app. And in a nutshell, we'll be looping, the data will be countries. And when we type a country in, the filtered countries will show up in a div or a UL tag down here, which we can click and then submit. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll just use the REPL at svelte.dev, and I'll copy the HTML. We can get rid of what's ever in the script tags, and then let's make some style tags. And we'll put all the CSS. Actually, we can, let's put it all in there. We could probably get rid of body. Okay, good. And then the next thing we're going to want to do is we have a bunch of strings here inside a JavaScript array, and this is going to be our data. So let's go ahead and set up our data here. And then the last thing we want to look into is the JavaScript, because this particular app, when I start typing, this right here is a div that they're adding, and they're adding it via JavaScript. If we come down here into the JavaScript, you can see they're creating a div element and then setting some attributes, an ID attribute and a class attribute. So let's just see if we can find this autocomplete items class. So if we inspect this, here it is. There's a div with a class autocomplete items, and then each country is nested inside of a div. Now, I think what we're going to do, instead of a div, this looks more like a list, so I'll probably use a UL element, an unordered list element, and then these countries will be LI tags instead of divs. So let's come back over here. And here's our HTML. So we've got a form, we've got a div surrounding this input, and then we have an input type submit, which is this button here. So below that, that's where we'll go ahead and put our UL tag with a class of autocomplete items. Now, I think I'm going to add a container element to it, because this is really going to be a container for the LI tags. And then the autocomplete items will actually be the LI tags. And we can sort that out later. But for right now, let's go ahead and deal with something else. So you can see our data looks really unwieldy. There's so many strings inside this array. So let's go ahead and practice something that Svelte provides called a store. And we'll go ahead and set up a store by creating a new document, and we'll call it countries-store.js. And inside here, we want to import one of their functions called readable. That's from the Svelte /store. And we'll create a variable called countries data. And we'll assign it to the readable function. And inside this readable function is where we put our data. And so I'll go ahead and take this out of here now. Now our data won't be seen until we export it. We need to export our data. So we'll export default countries data. Now, once you import the data, it's not accessible quite yet. We'll need with Svelte stores, we need to subscribe to them. So the way we do that is we'll go ahead and take the variable countries data and use a subscribe method. And the subscribe method returns an object, much like think of add event listener returns an event object. Well, subscribe also returns an object. And we'll call that items. And we'll set items to another variable that we'll make. Let's just call this countries. And this is actually what we're going to be using in our app here. So we'll set countries, we'll assign a countries to items. And then let's go ahead and console log countries so we can see what the data looks like. And there we go, there's our array. And so this is just a much more manageable way inside the app component without crowding it with all of these strings. Okay, the next thing we need to do is go ahead and take a look at this input, because this is actually how the app works, is we have to actually type something in this text input. And once we do that, every time we type something, we need to be calling a function. And that function will compare what we're typing with each of these countries to see when they match. So let's go ahead and get this input working. And using some Svelte syntax, we'll do on input. And because we're dealing with countries, let's name our function filter countries. And then we'll define that function up here. And let's just get it working. So we'll quickly console log something. Typing. So now when I actually type something, we should see the word typing in the console. So that's working. Good. So then the next thing we need to do is when we're typing something here, we want to be able to, when the country matches what we're typing, we want to store those. And so let's make an array. We'll call it filtered countries. And it'll be an empty array. And the idea is that when we start typing, we want to take this value and compare it with the countries. So down here in the input, what we can do is, normally in vanilla JavaScript, we use a value attribute, and we can still use that. But the Svelte way to do this is to bind the value. And we can bind the value to a variable that we'll create. Let's go ahead and create a variable that will represent the input value. Now you can call this whatever you want. I'm just calling it input value to make it obvious. We'll set it to an empty string. And we'll bind the value of this input to that variable. And then to see what we get back, instead of console logging typing, let's console log input value. So now if I start typing, you can see it immediately keeps track of this variable. So that's perfect. So now what we can do is we can incorporate this variable inside this function. So what we'll do is we'll take filtered countries and we'll iterate over countries using a filter higher order function. And what we'll do is when we come across a country, if that country starts with the input value, then go ahead and store it inside filtered countries. So let's go ahead and reactively console log filtered countries. So if we get any results back, we'll see those immediately down here. You can see the array is empty, but if I start typing FRANC, see we get France. And even before I finished France, we got French Polynesia, French West Indies. So that's good. So when we get results, they're storing them in the array immediately. Now, the thing that we're missing is once we get some results, we actually want to see them render on the screen here inside this unordered list that we created. And just to remind you what that looks like. So if we start typing, they're using a div, but we're using an unordered list. So what we need to do is once those results come in, we want to render them as li tags. And I think these li tags are going to have a class called Autocomplete items. So what we're going to do is, because when we get more than one result, we want to just loop through them and render them on the screen. Let's go ahead and take this and we'll create a new component and we'll call it country.svelte. And this component will literally just be this li tag. And what we want to go between here is the country name. And so why don't we call this something like that country name. And so this will be a variable representing each country that comes through. And then we need to export this variable so that we can, without exporting it, we won't be able to see it. So let's go ahead and import the country component from country.svelte. And down here, this is where we'll render the country component, and it's got one prop, which is country name. And we're going to get that prop by looping through the results in filtered countries. So let's go ahead and take filtered countries. And we'll use some Svelte syntax to create a loop. And then the singular. And so the country component requires a prop here. And so the country name will be filled in with country. Let's move some of these CSS rules over to the country component. So now if we go ahead and start typing in, good. Oh, I see. This is missing the container part. There we go. So now if I type something in, now we get a list. We just need to close up this little gap here, and that is probably from the input above. So let's do a margin of 0. See what that does. Yep, good. That closes it up. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is when we actually click this, we want this value, Faroe Islands, to show up inside the input. So when we click here, we need to actually put an on-click event listener. So let's go over to our component that represents these li tags. And down here in the li, let's add a reference to on-click. And then we'll pass that up to app. And then here in the country component, we'll define that. We'll do a callback function. And we'll call it set input value. And we'll set it with, we'll give it an argument. It'll accept this country as a string argument. So let's go up here and define that real quick. And what we want this to do is we want to basically set the input value to whatever this string is. So we'll just say input value assign to whatever this string is. Let's see what happens. Good. So as soon as I click, then this value changes. Then the next thing we want to do is address this submit button. But actually, before we do that, you notice that this menu has not disappeared yet. And even if I empty out the input, it's still there. So we have to refine our event handler here. So we only want to filter through the countries array and store them here if input value, that is this, if input value actually has characters. In other words, it evaluates to true. Okay, and it's still not disappearing. And I think that's because we still have countries inside our filtered countries array. So why don't we set up a reactive statement here if input value is negative, if it's false, that means in this current state, an empty string, then go ahead and assign filtered countries to an empty array. So now if we start typing and then we erase, as soon as this input evaluates to false, an empty string, then we clear out the filtered countries, and then that removes the UL element. Okay, the next thing we want to do is deal with the event listener for the form. In fact, we can go ahead and get rid of the action here. And let's do an onSubmit event listener, and the handler will be maybe submit value. And we'll make this event handler function now. And we want to say if there actually is a value here, if input value, then let's keep it simple. We'll just console log input value is submitted. So for example, if we type in France and then click submit, it'll say France is submitted. Else, if the user leaves the input blank but still clicks the submit button, let's call an alert and we'll say you forgot to type a country. So actually, if we click it now, we'll get the alert. Oh, I see what happens. Okay, so one thing we're going to need to add to this onSubmit event listener is prevent default. That way it doesn't actually try to submit our value. Fill it with French Polynesia, and as soon as we click submit, let's see what happens. Good, French Polynesia is submitted. And we could do some other things, like once it's submitted, maybe we go ahead and enter, we get rid of this UL. We could also empty out the input to actually by assigning input value to an empty string, that'll automatically empty the filtered countries array, which will get rid of the UL. So let's try that. So if I do FR again, we'll do French West Indies. As soon as I click submit, French West Indies is submitted, and then this is emptied out and the array is empty, so there's no UL list to render. So perfect. You know, the other thing that we can address here is you can see that there is a little gray line below here. That means that the UL element is actually showing right now. In fact, if I give it a height of, let's say, 200 pixels, you can see it's there, even though we don't have any countries in it. So we're still rendering this UL element even though we don't have any countries in the filtered countries array. So let's use some Svelte syntax here and make a if statement. If filtered countries dot length is greater than 0, then go ahead and render this. You can see that it's completely gone now. We don't see it anymore. The next thing I want to add to this is the ability to type in the input in lowercase or uppercase. Right now, if I type lowercase, nothing comes back. But if I type uppercase, it does. So the way we can solve that is by when each country comes through this filter function, we can just force it to lowercase or to uppercase, either one. And we'll do the same thing with the input value. We'll force it to lowercase. Now I should be able to type lowercase and it comes back fine. The next thing we're going to do is figure out how to bold the filtered items to match what we've put in the input. And to do that, we're going to have to rework this filtered countries event handler. In this case, what we're going to need to do is add strong tags around the filter results, and I'll show you that in a minute here. So if we go ahead and take a look at Gabon, you can see there's a div here, and inside they've put strong tags around the part that matches. And so we're going to try to do the same thing. We'll go ahead and make a function that just bolds whatever we put into it. Call it make match bold. And it will take an input of a string. Whatever string comes in, we will take that string and we'll use the substring method in JavaScript. And we basically want to match from the beginning of the string and include everything that is in the input value. Its total length. And we'll go ahead and store that in a variable called matched. And then we'll take that matched part, and what we'll do is we'll use string interpolation. We'll put strong tags around it. So the part that matches, we'll go ahead and put strong tags around it. Let's go ahead and store that in a variable. We'll call it make bold. We need to actually take this string. So far this hasn't made the string bold yet. We need to actually just take this string and replace those characters that match so we replace those matched characters with what we just made right here, the bold. So for example, if FRA are the matched characters, what this will do is put strong tags around them like this. And then what we need to do is take this, which represents make bold, And then we actually need to take the real string and, oops, we need to take this part and replace, that's what this part is, string.replace. We need to replace the FRA with this. So now our final string, this will be this third line. So let's get rid of that. Okay, let's go ahead and store this in a variable. We'll call it bolded match. And then we just want to return that. But the thing is that these are not really HTML elements yet. This is just a string, but we need it to be interpreted as HTML tags. So the way that we're going to do that is when we come back to the country component, here we have country name, but instead of country name, we're going to use @HTML. This is a lot like inner HTML and vanilla JavaScript. So by including @HTML, we're basically saying whatever we pass through here, and especially if we pass any kind of things that look like HTML tags, go ahead and actually interpret them as HTML tags. Good, so now that we have that, let's go back and work on our filtered countries. I think what we're going to do is we're going to replace this filter, because again, filter is not really something that you use to alter the output. The filter is like you see if it matches, and if it does, then you store the exact output in here. So for this, let's use something like a for each loop instead, or for each iterator. And we'll say if country to lowercase starts with input value to lowercase. So that's all the same. And then this one will end. Then let's go ahead and store these in filtered countries. Actually, no, let's take that back, because for each doesn't return, it doesn't return an array like filter and map does. So let's take that out. Let's go ahead and just make a temporary storage array. And what we'll do is we'll say if they do match, go ahead and take whatever's in storage array as well as add this match. And the match is country, but it's got to be more than country, because here is where we actually want to make bold. We want to make that bold. So what we'll do is we'll put the function in there, pass the country in. Remember, the country is coming in as a string, and this accepts a string. So if country to lowercase starts with input value to lowercase, go ahead and take it, add those bold tags around it, and then store it in this storage array that we have here. Now, once all of those have been gathered, once all of the matches have been gathered in the storage array, then we're going to go ahead and take filtered countries and we'll assign it to this storage array. So now all the matches that happen here will get stored in here, and then once this gets reassigned to a new value, then it should re-render here. Let's see what happens. Yep, good. Now it works. And it's still rendering here because, again, as long as filtered country has a country in it, it will render here. The only thing we've added is this function that will take the part that matches and kind of run it through this little factory here and add the strong tags. In fact, let's just check that out. Yep, they're the strong tags, so they got added. And because we added @HTML here in our country component, then these were interpreted as HTML tags, so it actually rendered properly on the DOM. So yeah, it appears to be working fine. Now, if I click on this, remember we have an on-click event listener here. So if I click on that, what shows in the input? What do you think? And that's not what we want. So the strong tag function works for this effect, but once we want the actual value in to the input, we're going to need to make another function. So we have a function called make bold match. Let's just go ahead and make one called remove bold. And remove bold will also take a string input. And basically what we want to do is return the string, but we'll use replace again to replace these strong tags with just an empty tag. So one way to do this that's kind of an obvious, it looks obvious, is the first argument. What we can do is just literally type in the less than sign, the strong word, and then the greater than sign. And what we would do is we would use these capture symbols to capture this pattern. And that will remove the first strong tag, but it won't remove the second one. But what we can do is chain another replace. And then what we would do is so now when we click on the country, when we click on this country, we actually want to make sure that remove bold, this remove bold function, is part of this set input value. So we want to set input value with country, but country now has strong tags, so we'll surround that with this function remove bold. So now if we do it, click on Zimbabwe, good, it's removed both of the tags. So this is one way to do it, just by chaining. You can do a replace and then chain another replace. But there's another way to do it. So this is another way. This is another way to do the regex. It's more abbreviated than this, but it's not as explicit, if you will. I mean, you're going to need to know a bit about regex to know what some of these symbols mean. Okay, and the last feature that we want to put on this list, this filtered list, is as you type something in, you should be able to use the up and down arrows on the keyboard to navigate through it. And then once you're on the selection you want, hit the return key, and then it populates. So let's tackle that last part. And the way we're going to do that, right now it works as long as we're using our mouse. And of course I can click and it gets that same effect. But if I go ahead and use the arrows, nothing works. So just like in vanilla JavaScript, we'd have to set up an event listener on the window object. We'll do the same thing in Svelte. Here, let me go ahead and just type it out. So this will be on the window object. And we're pressing the up and down key, so we'll just do on key down. And we'll go ahead and call a function. And for now, well, let's see. Let's call it navigate list. So that'll be the name of the function that we make. And let's go up into our script tags. Okay, so we'll need to, just like in vanilla JavaScript, we would use the event object. So I think here we're going to do the same thing. So we'll rely on the event object, and let's just go ahead and console log e.key. That's a down arrow, here's the up arrow. Okay, so the e.key, the event.key is registering. When we press the down arrow key, we want the style of this li tag to change from white with black text to, you can see if I click, to Dodger blue background with white text. And that rule is here. This came with it when we copied it from W3 Schools. It's this class called Autocomplete active. So we basically want to add this class to this li tag. So class, and add this class when something is true. Let's go ahead and create a variable up here, and we'll call it highlighted. So we have to set this up first. Add the class autocomplete active when highlighted when this variable is true. And we're exporting it over to app, and let's go ahead and set this up inside app as well. So on country, highlighted is true when, now in this each loop, one thing that you can pass is a counter in Svelte. So I just put a comma and then put I or index, whatever you want to put, but this will serve as a counter. And we'll say when the I equals, then we're going to have to make something. We'll keep track of the index of the li tags. We'll call it like highlight index. So we'll say let highlight index, and we'll have it equal null. We don't want to have it start at 0. We'll just have it start at null. So let's now shape this event handler function, which will get called every time we're typing on the keyboard here, every time there's a key down. Okay, and then the last part we want to set up is after you've highlighted a country, excuse me, if you press the enter key, then let's call set input value. And set input value requires a string, and we'll set it to highlighted country. Highlighted country is just a reactive variable that I've made that will follow the highlight index and use that as the index to pull out the string inside the filtered countries array. So now if we type, let's see, Tanzania is submitted, and then the array is emptied. Good. Let's go ahead and also put an else statement that will just return. None of these conditions are met, just return out of it. Okay, that's pretty much it.